You want to be there? Okay. So are you ready?
I am ready.
All right. It looks like you guys are ready before we got ready. Sorry about that. So welcome to the last session of the day. Fake news and public relations. So glad that you're here to share this. We have an amazing group of people to talk about this, and I'm really just going to turn it over to Kelly McBride. Do stick around afterward for the wrap-up, meaning we'll try to pull all these threads together. Actually, Kelly and Indira will pull all these threads together, and I will just signal them. And don't forget those green evaluation sheets. I really need them, and it would be great if you could fill that out. So, Kelly, over to you.
So it's interesting that we have spent so much time and energy talking about PR today and not had the PR professionals in front of us, and fortuitous that we now have them in front of us, because there have been several times when the journalists up here are like, well, I don't know anything about PR. I am one of those people. I don't know much about PR at all, although I will say my significant other owns a PR agency, and so he reminds me all the time that I don't know anything about PR when I try and give him advice. Joining us today are, oh shoot, I don't have your last names up here.
Ewing.
Thank you.
Professor Michelle Ewing.
So Michelle Ewing, and Michelle Ewing, so misinformation has been an issue for her for 25 years, working in an agency and with corporate public relations, and in public relations education. And while technology has improved communications in some ways, she believes it has also exacerbated communications. She considers herself fortunate to have prepared the next generation of public relations professionals. She believes that they will be advocates for transparency and truth and committed to making the world a better place. And she's also concerned about the growing lack of trust in business and government and media. She has made it her personal mission to educate students, family, friends, and whoever will listen that, and this is a quote from her, the Kellyanne Conways of the world aren't practicing ethical public relations. Yes, she has not done your profession a favor, has she? All right, and Chaz.
Chaz Withers.
Thank you, Withers. I have just Chaz. So Chaz first encountered fake news when he worked as a bartender at Ray's and Mother's Junction.
Mother's Junction.
Yeah. And he was privy to enormous amounts of misinformation. Most of it was between men and women sitting at the bar. He's very proud to have worked directly with the city of Cleveland and Mayor Jackson the last few years, first brought in to shape and manage communications during several challenging police cases and related trials, and then through the RNC last year when there were more than 10,000 international media here in town. One of his biggest concerns is that people are succumbing to seeking out news that suits their individual belief system or vantage point. And again, a quote from him, without being melodramatic, I'm worried about how that could weaken the fundamental foundation of democracy. So that gives you a little bit of background for both of them. I want to start. We have a couple cases that we're going to look at, but I want to start with this overview, and that is that there are actually 7 professional public relations people in the United States for every 1 professional journalist. So if this is a war, PR, the numbers are in the PR pros, right? Like if we're going to make a difference, we probably stand a better chance just by sheer numbers by bringing the PR pros into this fight. So let's start with this question. Why should people in public relations care about fake news?
I'll start. So whenever there's a decline in trust in the media, it undermines communications. And although public relations professionals have other ways now to directly communicate with our audiences, hence that's how technology has improved communications, it also has undermined it in that anyone, as we've heard today, can publish anything in a matter of seconds. And more audiences have difficulty in believing in information, trusting information. So if they're not trusting the news media, it creates a barrier for communicating with their audiences. And even if we can reach out directly to our customers, there's still that skepticism there that they're not trusting the information.
So it makes your job harder.
Yes, absolutely.
All right, Chaz, would you add anything?
Well, first, good afternoon, everybody. I was just curious about this idea of why it should matter. And so I took a look back just in the last week and the last month. And this is a snippet of fake news as it relates to corporate clients. There was a story this week about Dollar Tree closing all of its stores. 24,000 shares on social media. That company opened the week with a $19 billion market cap, and in one day they lost over $600 million in value. Carnival Cruise Lines this week, you may have seen coverage about a Facebook story that popped up that they were giving away free cruises to hurricane victims. Completely untrue. 58,000 shares on social media. I don't know if anybody followed the Hobby Lobby story that came up this week. That one has got more rooted on the political side of the spectrum, but nonetheless, 70,000 shares on social media. And then just something really interesting in the last day that is not fake news. It was Twitter's CEO, Ev Williams, who was criticizing social media platforms, basically noting that his quote was, "There's a fundamental problem with our information ecosystem when attention that gets rewarded, not the quality of information." If you went back just over the last month, Starbucks was the subject of an attack where they were said to be giving away free coffee on Dreamer Day for anybody that was an undocumented migrant. There was a fake story about Ulta closing all of its stores. There was a fake story about an Xbox console that exploded and killed a teenager. Again, none of this was at all true. Costco was no longer selling memberships. Over 100,000 shares on social media. And this is the one that I think really drives home what the real impact of this can be. This actually goes back about 3 months ago. Pepsi's CEO, Indra Nooyi, there was a story that she told anyone that was a Trump supporter that they could take their business elsewhere. And if you want to talk about impact, Pepsi is a $160 billion company, and in the span of less than a month, they lost $8 billion in market cap. So when we talk about why it matters to our clients, it matters because it's material, because it has a direct and demonstrable impact on their business, because it spreads to their people, and I know both Michelle and I feel a very strong emotion about one of the really important things on this subject is how to talk to your own people versus worrying about what's going on outside. But one little hot take that I will share with all of you guys, that I think in this environment where fake news has really become the norm, and it's crept into our psyche and our daily news cycle in a way that we've never seen before, one of the net impacts of that, and we're already seeing it, is that you're going to see hyper-aggressive attacks on companies, oftentimes from competitors, and they're going to do it under the guise of fake news. So buckle up, it's going to get very bumpy.
Taking a page out of the Russian playbook.
Very much so.
If you will. You both talked about the task of educating audiences, but what does that actually mean?
Well, it starts with, we were just talking outside here before the session. One of my research areas is internal communication. So I'm a huge advocate that communications begins internally. So it starts with educating our employees so they become informed advocates for the company and the brands. They can help monitor this fake news. They can step up. They know how to step up, when to step up, when there is false information about your company. But overall, it begins with educating them about what's our mission, what are we trying to do here, what are the ethical practices for our company as well as for our industry, and make sure they're trained to behave. Because I think another key point we want to make, this leads with good behavior. It leads with good behavior and communicating that behavior. So educating the employees and then reaching out externally and developing those relationships with your customers, with your thought leaders, your community leaders, with journalists, but developing that reputation that you are going to deliver credible sources. You're going to provide access to information both in good times and bad times, and that starts with also educating your senior leadership to do that. But overall, making everyone have this relationship with that company or with that brand so that they trust you. That it's all about trust. Whether you trust
Are companies
us.
actually doing that, educating their employees to be their own information ambassadors?
Some companies are, yes. One of my research areas is using social media for employee communications, both internally and actually training them to become advocates.
Okay.
So many of our clients, if there was a common thread, and our clients run the gamut from Fortune 100 to much smaller companies to civic organizations, kind of anything in between. They're overworked, they're overwhelmed, they don't have enough staff. So while there may be a 7-to-1 ratio, they would tell you that they still need more people to do their job. And one of the things that they don't have a sense of is what's going on in the outside marketplace, especially in a real-time way. So one of the things that we just talk about is, I think increasingly, if there was an imperative, it's going to be the ability to see, feel, hear, and understand what's taking place in terms of discussions about your organization on a real-time basis. So definitely with your employees, but also the speed and urgency with which something can take off and become a small story that then is shared a few times. And it used to be days that could turn into a viral situation. Now it's minutes. And then you've got to react to it, you've got to have a position and substantiate that. So the amount of education that has to go on with clients, just understanding the impact of these things. It's also, when you're talking about fake news or misinformation or disinformation, I think we've heard all of those different terminologies today, it's understanding what matters and what doesn't. There are things that are going to come up that may not feel very good, but they're of very little import. It's having your radar attuned to when those things come up that can really make a difference in your enterprise, could hurt your employees, could damage your values, damage your reputation. That's when it's so important to really have a much more attuned sense to that.
So, Michelle, you brought the PRSA Code of Ethics.
Yes.
And it's up right behind you.
There's been some discussion during the sessions today about trusting PR professionals. And so what I wanted to make sure that everyone understands is that we do have a code of ethics. Do all PR professionals follow this? No. We've got our Kellyanne Conways of the world? No. But we train our students about these ethics, and as an industry, these are our code of ethics. These help us to make sure that we make ethical decision-making about how we communicate, but also how we work with senior leadership to operate the company. Mm-hmm. So again, I think it's one person at a time making a difference and calling out people who don't uphold these ethics. When Kellyanne Conway made her famous, alternative facts statement, it took PRSA a little too long, I think, to come out with a statement, but they did come out with a statement saying that absolutely we do not uphold alternative facts. There's facts and there's facts. Our job is that we do not deliberately undermine communications, that we're truthful. So I just wanted to make the point that sound public relations practices is all about ethics.
We've already touched on social media, and I didn't think it would take us long to get there. There are general best practices on social media for a corporation. If you guys had to give the bullet point highlights of those, what would you say they are?
Yeah, one big thing for me is, we talk a lot about either you're telling your story or someone else is going to tell it for you. So in an era where fake news can kind of come out of the ether and attack you in a way that you never expected, part of what I think is critically important is, are you telling your story, helping people understand what you do, what your organization does, what the values and integrity of your organization are. So when we talk about a content strategy for organizations, making sure that they're substantiating the things that they're really about, and then using social media platforms to take that out. A lot of times I feel like you're making equitable investments in the bank for your brand. Because there's going to come some time for any organization where there's going to be withdrawals on that. Something's going to happen that you're going to be exposed or you're going to be vulnerable, but have you done enough to really have credibility with the audiences that matter most to you? So for us, I just really think social is the next extrapolation. It's your traditional communications, your internal communications. It's a different channel. It's going to be different 3 years ago than it is right now. I think if we could predict anything, we know that's going to be the case. So just making sure you're consistent across all those platforms, that you have a plan, that it's not parsimonious, making sure that it's all connected, I think is a critical element.
And I would just add to that, for all channels, for all communications, you got to understand your audiences. That's 101. Understanding what the audiences care about, what they're interested in, and creating that content strategy so that you're sharing information that's relevant and useful to them. It's not promotion. It's not, I don't even want to use that word, spin. It's all about helping whether it's the employees or the customers, help them better their lives, or use your product better, your service better, but creating understanding. That's how you create a conversation, is by sharing useful information back and forth.
Well, and I've always understood that bank metaphor that you just used to be your insurance against when you screw up, right?
Your reputation.
Yeah, like you do something that is truly harmful to your own reputation. But you're suggesting now that this is insurance against fake news also, when somebody else does something. We should look at this Disney example.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So, hang on. I think I can do this. Nope, I can't do that. Could you advance the slide?
So, according to this article, Mickey Mouse was never going to be around anymore because Disney was closing after the Hurricane Irma. I think there's another slide that then first it talks about just Disney in general, and the next one is about the campground permanently closed at Walt Disney due to Hurricane Irma. So this was off of a false website. Who knows why? I was wondering, what's the motivation? Someone doesn't like Disney. I don't know. Who knows why? So this came out. This was all over the internet, and I thought this was a good example of how, first of all, Disney does have the reputation in terms of they're the creator of happiness, of magic.
And they have a pretty good social brand, right? Like they have a really good presence on Facebook.
So what I liked about this, they came right out head on with this. The next, what's the next one?
Go one more.
Go one more. So they came right out. They have a team of digital, and there's a lot of job opportunities here for students. There's a digital team that's just ready and monitoring these conversations. They're trained on how to create a conversation. But if you look at these tweets, some of these tweets are directly at people retweeting this information, saying, "Hey, it's false information," or "Hey, here's where you need to go for the right information." So they're directly communicating with the people that are spreading the information. So I thought that was smart, going into the platforms, Facebook and Twitter, where it was being shared, and saying, hey, this is false. And then another way they did it, they used what we call your own channels, the channels that you own, your website. They they stated a statement on Hurricane Irma. They actually created a question and answer questions about the hurricane, what parks were closed, when they were closed, what was going on with the hotel guests, when they would reopen. So there was all this information that creating the narrative, creating a narrative. There's a statement on Facebook, and it was always directing them to more information. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to create access to credible information. And then I thought this was interesting too. They showed what was going on in the hotels because all these people were sequestered in the hotels. So they created activities for the guests, and they were sharing that narrative of, okay, yeah, maybe the park's closed down, but we're still trying to create that Disney experience. And they had even another tweet just saying, be kind to our employees. Our employees are here to help you, and we're overwhelmed because of the situation. And then just updates on what was going on. So I just thought it was a really effective example of quickly getting in there, setting the record straight. Disney will be back, and here's when we're going to open up.
Yeah, that's a great example. So, all right. So tell me, what do you guys do differently now as PR professionals, specifically in response to fake news? Like to keep yourself sort of in shape to be able to respond to it?
I'll go first. Back over a decade ago, in 2006, that was the first class that we introduced in terms of using web for public relations strategy here at Kent State. So in 2006, we recognized that, hey, we need to start teaching about web. And so I'm thinking about that now. It's been more than a decade later, and my colleague Stephanie Moore, I'm not sure if she's here, but she's taken this class and other digital classes up to the next level. But that's when we really recognized in our curriculum that we need to be monitoring 24/7. 24/7, you've got to be monitoring what's going on with your brand and what's going on with these conversations, and you've got to have that plan in place to be ready to respond. So I think in terms of digital communications, that's the key thing, is that there's all these conversations going on, and you need to be part of it, and you also need to be monitoring what people are saying about your company or brand.
So my experience on this goes back 17 years on fake news. I kid you not. I was working for a company called AnswerThink. It was a spinoff from KPMG. They had acquired a number of organizations, and it was pre-Twitter, pre-Facebook. But what was really big at that time were Yahoo message boards, if anybody in here really remembers those. And it was the Wild West. I mean, it was unattributed commentary. You could do it under an autonomous moniker. And it was pre, if I go on cleveland.com now and I read the comments, I think that's the worst place in the entire world. It was a little funnier, but it was very interesting. So at our company, there was somebody that was operating under the pseudonym Aquacool 2000. I bet if you called that up real quick, there's actually a story about it. And this person was hugely critical of the CEO of the organization. I mean, in a way, made fun of his laugh, the way that he dressed, how he comported himself in meetings, the entire 9 yards. And the CEO of the company obviously took this very personally.
Is it Aquacool or
Aquacool 2000?
Cool 2000, yeah.
Aquacool 2000. There it is. And so if you put them all together, I bet it pops up. There it is. You can run messages. So anyway, the company decided to try and find out who this was, and it was a landmark case because they got Yahoo to give up his name and his identity, and he then sued the company. What was most interesting to me is Aquacool 2000 was my boss, and he was the one criticizing the CEO of the company, so it was an insider. Didn't really matter. He'd sold his company. He was making a lot of money in the deal. He was very happy to sort of get his transaction and walk away. But it was the first time that I'd really seen, because he was making things up about the CEO. It was very petty for somebody that was 55 years old. But it was an indoctrination into how you could go after somebody, spark a reaction, and then what that meant.
Did he win his lawsuit about them giving out his name, about Yahoo?
He did not, but it morphed, and now those social media services, they're in a position where they will not give out information
Right.
unless there's a government entity involved. So it's become a very complex piece of litigation. I would say that the biggest change for me, Kelly, is I already had a very high degree of skepticism. It's gone up. And what I really believe is in planfulness. I don't think any organization can think too far ahead, consider all the contingencies, and just when you think you've considered everything, go beyond that, because something that you would never expect, something that's so far afield, will arrive at your doorstep.
Well, there's also so much to keep up with, right? Like, how much time do you guys spend on Snapchat?
A little bit.
Right? But like, that's like one of the most popular mediums.
But a lot of my staff spends a lot of
College
time
students, how much time do you, raise your hand if you spend a lot of time on Snapchat.
Yeah.
Yeah. Not during class, though,
I'm
right?
going to turn mine on so that we can all find each other.
Yeah, they don't.
It's true.
They
You're
don't
right.
want
You're
us to
right.
find
All
it.
right. My bad. I don't know what I was thinking. My kids won't even follow me on Snapchat.
But Kelly, you bring up a good point. The channels keep changing and the technology's changing, but the strategy's the same. The strategy is all about figuring out where your audience is at. What channels are they using? What information do they care about? And then just being prepared to communicate content that's relevant, and then listen for content that you think is going to undermine your trust and your credibility. Right? Would you?
And don't overreact. I mean,
Yeah.
I think you have to have just a balance of understanding that the informational landscape, you guys have all heard today, is incredibly complex. It's changing all the time. We all know it's going to be dramatically different 2 years from now than it is today. So it takes a seasoned hand sometimes to be able to look at that, understand what's real, what's rhetoric, what really matters, what doesn't, how much do you want to try and engage somebody and get in an online fight versus
Right.
Let's tell our story, talk to our employees, and that's going to be our long tail on what we're trying to do.
That's probably crisis strategies. You want to be real careful that you don't fan that flame to turn it into like a raging inferno.
Yeah, and but it is, just to spend a little bit more time on the plethora of platforms that are out there now, it is sort of like a never-ending exercise that you have
Yes.
to go through, where you're looking at what platforms are out there, where is your audience, where do you need to make an investment, how do you get smart about different platforms, and how do you constantly explore. Like every time I look at a new platform, I'm always looking at, how are people going to use this, right? Because it turns out that people use Twitter differently than they use Facebook, right?
For
And they
different
use Snapchat differently than they use either one of those. And so I think there's a tendency, once you've been in the business for 10 or more years, to think, I've got this down, but it's a dynamic environment that's always changing, and you sort of always have to be prepared to flex that muscle.
Right. The plus with technology is that it's created lots of access to data. So we can now become more informed public relations practitioners. The data is much more accessible. So that helps with some of your questions about how do we prioritize what channels that you want to focus on? Because you're not going to focus on all of them. You're going to look at your audience. You're going to figure, okay, we can tell through research where our audience are spending their time at and how they're spending their time on those channels. And that's when you start fine-tuning your content strategy. Technology
is going to make a huge difference too. There's a company in Cleveland actually that I just saw a beta, and there's a million tools, Cision and NetBase, where you can sort of monitor conversations in real time. Theirs has the ability, it's basically a pulse, and you can watch a story be placed, shared, grow, contract, and then all of a sudden explode. And the only way you're going to be able to keep an eye on some of that stuff is if your technology is continually
and that's all
expanding.
You got to pay for all of that, right?
There's some free tools, but that you're definitely paying for that.
Yeah. So, Michelle, you talked about conducting a risk assessment and looking for triggers and warnings with a topic or a company around potential misinformation. How does one even begin to do such a thing?
So again, it starts with doing your research, and you always should be conducting a risk assessment for any public relations program because you're trying to figure out where are there threats for the company at. It could be threats in operation and communication, but if we're going to talk about fake news, you're going to think about what would be some triggers. Who would be some opponents that might want to create some problems for your company? So you'd want to do that research, and you'd identify those issues. So let's say my example would be, I come from a healthcare background, a hospital. So probably the number one thing with a hospital with social media and false information could be someone that's complaining about poor quality care. So you got to figure out what would be the process in place to determine if that statement's true. How would you quickly do that? To your point about how do we quickly arm our resources and figure out, was there a quality care issue, or is this just an unhappy patient? Is it just one patient? How many patients is it? So you would identify these triggers, and then you'd work with your team to figure out if this issue comes up, who's going to be the source? When do we respond? How do we respond? How will we find out the volume of who's following, who's ever complaining, the influencers? So you just kind of create a playbook to be ready for it.
Okay, so you're looking at threats.
Threats, triggers, opponents. You're also going to look who your influencers are, both maybe against you or as well as for you, because that's another point I would like to make is that you need to build community. You need to be ready for this response because often you might, depending on the allegation or the issue, sometimes your community will come in for you and defend you. An example, we had Joe he's a social media manager for the Cleveland Indians, and he always talks about how some false information is created about the team. Not right now while they're winning, but this is back, Everyone loves them right now. But he was saying that often their fans would quickly come in, and they'd have the stats and the data, and they would direct them to the resources here. So that's another key point, too, as part of this risk assessment. Figure out, what are the threats, what's the strategy to deal with the threats, and then who can help you.
And how do you figure out how to, I imagine with the hospital, if you have somebody, maybe their loved one died and they're particularly aggrieved about that. But you have to figure out how to respond to that, right? Because you could magnify it or amplify it and make it worse.
Right, and ideally in that situation, if someone died, you would want to try to take that offline and have a conversation with the person in that particular case. And that's a decision you have to make.
Not get into a Twitter war with them?
No, because like you said, it could be a grieving person, so that's a totally different situation here. So I think you'd want to take that offline and know who's going to do it, who's going to have the conversation, when they're going to have the conversation. And if there was a problem or something was appropriate, what are the steps to deal with it?
All right. Anything you would add to risk assessments?
So a very specific example, we do a lot of work in the aviation industry. Excuse me, Southwest Airlines is a big client. And if you think about whether it was Southwest, United, American, take any of the big carriers, and the number of consumer touch points that they have in any given day, and if you've traveled, air travel these days is not exactly the most fail-safe endeavor that we have. So you think about something that goes wrong with your ticket, something that goes wrong where a number of flights are canceled, something that goes wrong where there's a bad interaction, as we've seen this year with United and American, where somebody on the plane actually behaves poorly. So one of the things that we go through with them on a regular basis is two things. One, sort of looking at their current best practices across all those fields. Are we ready for this scenario, this scenario? We do a lot of testing, crisis preparedness, and activities with them. We also do a look forward on 6 months out, 12 months out, what are the trends coming that could have a dramatic impact? And it could be big stuff like hedging on fuel costs for airlines is a very big deal. It could be change in routes. It could be major weather events like we've had. So are you ready for all those things? You're never going to cover all the bases, but I think just having some idea of where your primary areas of exposure when you're talking about risk assessment, and then having a very thorough process for how are we going to react to that, what are we going to do when something goes askew. And
How many people do the airlines have? I'm always amazed when people tweet the airlines. The airlines respond.
Very quickly.
Like almost always. How many people do they have at any one given time just responding to Twitter and Facebook?
You know, they've got a communication staff of almost 100 people. They have a number of those people that are devoted just purely to social media. They're very careful about that stuff. You know, if they're going to engage in a social media platform, they've got very specific rules about how they do that, what they don't do. But when you see, you know, in the pantheon of fake news or misinformation, all this kind of stuff, I think is also huge opportunity. Because if you're talking about your customers and they actually like you and they're flying on your airline, for example, and they complain about something, then find a way to connect with them. They'll feel like you've listened to them, and especially if you can find a solution, you've deepened loyalty, not damaged it.
So is there something that you can do proactively for a company to prevent fake news? Can you, I mean, like if we go back to the medical model, can you recommend exercise or taking vitamins or something like that?
I think preparation, I would just say, you know, when I went back to the examples that I just gave to start this, so many of those examples, I have no idea where they came from. And why somebody decided that they wanted to post about Dollar Tree closing all of its stores.
Or Disney closing, like why?
Or Disney, you know, I don't know where those are coming from. There's a lot of, you know, Damaso called up earlier a number of the websites that are just pure fake news. There's a ton of stuff out there that are now websites where it's a prank. Mm-hmm. And see what the reaction is, and then when people click through, somebody's making money on that endeavor. My quote from Ev Williams at Twitter, Facebook and Facebook in particular, you know, is highly incentivized to see stories catch fire. So, excuse me, I had a sinus infection yesterday, and I'm just getting over it. So. Thank you.
There you go.
So I don't know, you know, are there vitamins you can take? I think just being prepared and trying to recognize as many points of exposure as you have is the best you can do.
And back to our point about just having that reputation and those relationships in place, so that if something happens, you know about it, and you're ready to act.
All right. I do want to come to the audience for questions because I know we have a lot of people who are studying PR or are PR professionals. So I just want to give you a heads up, and if you get the microphone in your hand, that would be great. So you guys are always talking about owned media and earned media, and I actually had to look up what these meant. So owned media is the stuff that you control, like your press releases, your own social media feed, newsletters that you might send out, and earned media is the stuff that you try and influence, so news coverage, right? I got that right?
Yes, you got it right.
Okay, give me my degree. In both of these, there are defensive and offensive tactics, right? So we've talked a lot about some of the, I guess those would be offensive tactics, right? Like the things that you do ahead of time to try and get ahead of the story. But what are some of the more defensive tactics that you might use?
So for owned media, so that would be our social media channels, whether it's Twitter or Facebook. In terms of defense, so you recognize something. I mean, it's really simple rules. You monitor, you debunk, and you determine the appropriate way to respond. So 3 simple things you need to do. So based on being planning, on the allegation, you have a plan in place on how you would respond and when you respond and who responds. So that would be one step in terms of addressing or defending your brand. And also if you have that, again, I feel like I'm repeating myself, but if you have that community in place, a defense would be that your community might come to your defense for your brand too.
Right, but you can't do that, right? I mean,
Yeah.
you can,
You have to
sometimes
wait.
you can ask
It
them.
has to be, no, I would even just, it should be authentic. It should be authentic. You know, they should come through. So let's go back to Cleveland Indians example. We sit back, we wait. they have to come on their own to defend the brand. You don't want to, that's being unethical to have like plants in place, or it goes even back to the review problem where there's plants in place. No, we don't want to do that. It has to be authentic. And then with the earned media, that just goes back to having a working relationship with the journalists, understanding what the journalist's interests and needs are, and giving them access to credible sources and multiple sources. Yes, we're coming from an advocacy standpoint. We get that. But that doesn't mean that we're, again, going back to ethics, we want honest communications. We want to tell our story too.
Yeah, and that reminds me that just a couple of years ago, there was a fair amount of controversy in the PR field over reviews.
Yes.
Right? And so just the background on that is that a lot of PR professionals were filling out like Yelp reviews.
Well, I hope they're not PR professionals, but yeah, right. There's a problem with people doing it, or hiring people to do it.
Hiring people to do it, and they're not authentic, right?
Right.
And it was your use of the word
corruption.
authentic.
Yes, it's corruption.
So, I mean, the PR industry kind of came together and said, we're not going to do that, right?
Right. It definitely undermines the ethics because it's not authentic.
But yet your clients probably ask you to do it all the time, right?
And that goes back to, I think, Chaz's point is educating the client. And I know from my agency background, if a client didn't want to listen to practice ethically, then we would be willing to walk away from that client. And do you want to talk about that?
I'd just be completely in the same boat. I think from an earned media standpoint, an example you mentioned up front, so we did a lot of work with the RNC last year. A unique opportunity for Northeast Ohio. You had 10,000 media coming from all over the world. They're coming to cover the RNC event, but it was a unique opportunity for them to get exposure to Northeast Ohio, not just Cleveland, but out to Youngstown, out to Toledo, everywhere in between, Akron. And one of the things that we count on, I was in the journalism track here at KSU and then sort of went into PR. I really feel like we're in the relationship business. So while that sounds really trite, we have cultivated relationships with media all over the world. When they were coming to town, we already had embedded credibility and trust. And we knew that they were coming here, they wanted to get stories out of their trip that weren't necessarily just political in nature. I mean, it ran the gamut from food to entertainment to what's taking place in Northeast Ohio, why it's a great place to live, what's going on with the Cavs, what's going on with LeBron, et cetera, and everything in between. So, I think a good offense is the best defense. I really believe that. And cultivating relationships, building credibility with people, understanding journalists have a job to do, and they've got things that they need to fill out on their portfolio, and how can you best assist in that, is going to get you through tough times.
And there is a model for a good relationship between a PR professional and a journalist,
Very
right?
much so.
I mean, like it actually exists. I think there's a lot of mythology around the cynicism of journalism and that they don't trust any PR professionals. But my experience has been that when a PR professional knows what you need and can help you get it,
Be a resource.
yeah, and isn't offended when you don't take their pitch, that's like the basis of a good relationship.
Or they call you up and they call you up and I did a lot with merger and acquisitions, and I'm thinking of Cheryl Powell at the Beacon. I don't know if she's still there, but I can remember her calling me up saying, I see that, it was a health plan, I see that so-and-so filed some papers, and I said, Cheryl, give me 10 minutes. I knew she was onto the story, and we wanted to tell the employees first. So we had that relationship where I could go talk to the CEO of the health plan and say, hey, she's onto the story. She's been good to us. We've been good, had this good relationship. So we were able to work with her, and she was able to tell the story because she wanted obviously the exclusive on it, and then we wanted to tell the employees. So yeah,
Right.
I had some really good experiences with reporting.
Sometimes
Yeah.
it works great, sometimes it doesn't, by the way. Just a quick aside, there was a guy, I was working at an agency in Akron, and I was trying to get in to see this reporter at U.S. News and World Report for about 3 years. Kept calling, and I finally called, and I got his admin, and I asked if I could talk to him, and she said, he passed away. And I was like, oh, I'm so sorry to hear that. And there was like a pause, and she said, you know what, he didn't really want to get together with you anyway. so too soon? Too soon for her.
She probably didn't like him. I don't know. What kind of reporter has an admin anymore? Anyway, question in the back there.
Hello. I actually asked the question earlier to the news panel. My name is Heather Bolshridge. I work on a pretty controversial program in Akron, the AWR program, where we are charging insane rates on water bills to pay for some EPA mandates, and so it's been my job, with the help of an assistant until recently, to rebrand the entire program and make it positive, because the city had standpoints back and forth. So
Condolences. That's tough. That's a tough go.
it's been insane, but it's been going great. I mean, we are making huge strides, and I'm so proud. But my question was really, in this time of fake news, how can we bridge the gap with journalists? Because, you know, obviously they want to tell the story that people are interested in, and when you have a very negative platform from a whole entire community, how can you convince them and just help them help you, so that you can get them to tell your story? I mean, again, it's been going well, but I also feel like there's a lot more room we could do.
It's a really tough scenario, and I give you credit for having tried to negotiate a big change there, because that's a big pivot. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of effort. I mean, it's basic. Back to the idea of credibility and trust. If you guys are really making a fundamental change, and you're making changes that are going to benefit ultimately the end user, then continue down that process of telling that story, building that narrative, and there will be some tip point on that, but it won't be easy. Kelly mentioned up front, I did a lot of work with the mayor of Cleveland the last few years. Mayor Jackson is not a communicative person. He's one of the most apolitical politicians I've ever met in my life. He doesn't care. If he was sitting in this room, he really wouldn't care what your opinion was. When we were going through all the challenges with the trials, everything from Tamir Rice to everything in between, police being on trial, it was a really challenging period, and it was imperative that he be more communicative, that he connect with people, that they see that he cared, that they saw he was in control as mayor. And he didn't want to do it. One of the first times I ever met him, he said, "Don't ever try and turn me into a cheerleader. That's not what I am." I said, "I'm not going to try and do that." But what we are going to do is we're going to meet with media regularly. We're going to be transparent. You're going to fill in the blanks for them about what's taking place and give them a sense of understanding and give them a sense of ownership of the change that we're trying to effect here. And he did that pretty successfully over a period of time. But it does. It takes some time, especially, you know, when you're digging out of a brand hole that's deep like that. Stay the course.
Yeah, I would also say one of the most important things when you're the PR professional and you're representing a client that has a negative image with the audience, you have to, when you're working with journalists around that negative image, you have to be honest about why the negative image exists, right? And so often, especially with government and quasi-governmental agencies, the PR professionals, either because, well, I don't know why, but my experience has been that a lot of the PR professionals for government agencies, when things are going badly, get defensive and go into well, that was last month, right? That was what things were like last month. And it's like, and journalists feel like they're advocates for the community. And so if you get into a relationship where you're asking that journalist to take your side over the community, you'll never win. Because the journalist is always going to feel like her responsibility is to advocate for the community. So you have to somehow be able to have a conversation about why, an honest conversation about why whatever it was that happened.
I was going to say, what's the business rationale behind it? I'll try to educate the journalists, like, what's the business behind it? And create that one-on-one dialogue and say, and you're right, you don't ever want to ask the reporter to change a story, but can you just share, here's our side of it, or here's what's going on with the company, and this is why we're doing this.
And if there were culpabilities, like, you've got to own those, right? Like, I mean, think about, like, the Flint water crisis, right? Like at a certain point, if you want to turn a corner with an audience, you have to own what happened in the past.
You have to step up. If there's an ethical breach or misinformation, you've got to step up and share what happened.
But you guys have made operational changes, right? I mean, that's a core of what you've tried to do.
Yeah. All right, other questions? Does somebody have the mic over here? You have the mic. We have a question down here in front. While we're getting the mic, how do you guys, I mean, you know, I'll be the first to admit, not all journalists are credible, right? Like some journalists are never going to give somebody a fair shake. So what do you do when you're judging a journalist? What do you look for?
I don't think that's changed. I always did my homework. I checked out bios. I checked out the stories that the journalists reported on. Now we have social channels now to check out how the reporter's using the social channels. So I just prepared myself for what's the personality of the reporter that I could find out, and also in terms of what are they covering, how are they covering it.
Yeah, and I think putting yourself in their shoes, you know, to what you said before, Kelly, a reporter is there representing coverage from some vantage point, whether it's, you know, from the public's vantage point, whether they've got some experience in that area. You just have to understand how they're coming to it, and then trying to figure out if there's some way to tell the story that they're going to understand in a different way. But you know, you're not going to change somebody's stripes too much.
All right, Indira.
I wanted to ask how you advise us, what your concerns are as PR professionals when you see how PR from a political standpoint, attitudes are changing. And I don't know if you guys have been following this because we've been all in this conference all day, but Sean Spicer threatened Mike Allen, who writes that Axios newsletter, this morning. It was incredible, and for those who haven't seen it, basically Mike Allen was texting him and saying, hey, Sean, are you going to be going on TV? You're going to get a contributor gig? What's going on? I mean, just basically a reporter question. Right. And Sean Spicer responded by saying, don't ever contact me again, and if you do, I will contact authorities for your harassment. And I thought, wow, okay, he's a PR professional. He was the White House spokesman, and a reporter asking a question and checking his facts before running a story is by definition not harassment or a crime. That's reporting. If he didn't contact him, that would be bad. So when an example is being set, you mentioned Kellyanne Conway, I'm mentioning Sean Spicer.
That's a challenge. That's inappropriate behavior. That's not what public relations professionals
But what is the, you know, they're creating a certain standard, and some people are going to follow that. Some people, particularly in political communications, and I'm not saying right or left, I bet people from all parts of the spectrum are going to take a leaf from that playbook and do it. So how do you, and someone actually said earlier today that from the city council PR person or whatever, you know, people are constantly trying to spin and lie or harass journalists. So what kind of message can you guys as an industry set so that people don't follow Sean Spicer and Kellyanne Conway's example? And what advice do you give to us as journalists when we're dealing with people like that?
Well, first, one of my key points is that we would never train our students here to respond like that. The whole idea is creating a beneficial relationship. So I am sometimes when I'm watching this news conference, it's just, I could just reach through the TV and
smack him upside the
head. What are you doing? So it's hard for me to tell you what Sean Spicer is doing, Kellyanne, but that's not ethical practice. So my hope is that if we continue to train the next generation, that they're going to understand how the importance of developing that relationship with journalists. And in terms of advice for you, keep on reporting. That's mine. Keep on reporting, and we as PR professionals need to call those people out. So when the industry came, when Kellyanne Conway said that about alternative facts, we as an industry got to say, no, that's not right. We have to call that. We have to call them out. PRSA did, yes. Yes, they did. Yes. If you Google PRSA statement on alternative facts, it might come up.
Yeah.
So we have to do that. There's more of us calling people out when they act like that, because it's not right. It's
Well, and it is how, I mean, it is one of the things journalism tends to call each other out when people behave badly. It's sort of it's an industry, really. We were talking about it earlier, but I think it's a recent thing for public relations professionals to do that.
Right, and even when did anybody watch the Emmys when Sean Spicer came out? I found that we watched the Emmys when Sean Spicer came out and was making fun of, the size of the Emmy audience. I found that offensive too, because he was just right out saying that he made it up, yes. Right?
Yeah.
He made it up.
And whitewashing his image by going on.
Right. So again, I think we have to call out that behavior. That is not who the PR professional is about.
All right. Other question.
You hit a nerve with me.
I have a question from the perspective. I practice media law, and one of the very odd things that we've seen happen, and it's just kind of a new trend that's barely been exposed, but is reputation management companies filing almost fake lawsuits against fake defendants in an effort to get injunctions and agreed settlements to get de-indexing. You're nodding, so you know what I'm talking about. And I'm curious about the PR industry's response to that, what you might know about that, and sort of any thoughts you have on it.
Yeah, so let's slow it down and explain the practice. So reputation management companies will file a fake lawsuit against a fake defendant in order to make a real publisher look bad, right?
Well, in order to get the de-indexing.
Right, and then
Yes.
get Google to de-index
Correct.
a real publisher.
Correct. Sometimes they'll do it by having the fake defendant write a comment, and then they'll sue the commenter. But the idea is that comment, or the agreement based on the comment, would get the entire post
Article
taken
de-indexed by Google.
and taken
Right.
down.
To be honest, I wish I had a deeper knowledge of it to really have a disposition about it. One thing that I think I can say definitively, though, there was a very significant FTC ruling earlier this week, just reading something here, warning letters to a subset of original 90 letter. This basically was going out to people on social media who are claiming some sort of relationship with a product that doesn't exist. Along with what you just mentioned, I think you're going to see tremendous litigation in the next year where there's going to be an attack on fake news sites to remove them from different platforms. You're going to see the FTC and other governmental bodies take a much more proactive stance going after what they see as misappropriation or misconduct. So, and then what I mentioned before earlier on, I think you're also going to see hyper use of competitive intelligence tools for companies to go after other companies under the guise of anonymity. So I think it's going to be a very, very interesting time. What it's going to do, I think, is put a huge onus on journalists to be able to dig through an enormous amount of muck and murk. And that's going to be a real challenge because the complexity of some of these things is 20 layers deep. So how do you really get to the truth? I think you're going to see just an awful lot of litigation and legislation coming up around these areas.
All right, one more question.
Real quick, one of the things, this is Lee Berry. I'm Lee Berry at Kerman Communications. I spoke earlier. One of the things we've encountered in our PR work is that we get wonderful media responses to our press releases saying how good it would be for their audience to run our story. However, there's going to be a fee for running it. And so we're seeing opportunistic journalism as well. And I'm wondering if... Right, they tend to be bloggers, but I'm just wondering, because obviously if they can make money, they can, they have an incentive to also spread fake news. They get paid to do it. So, yeah, what is the industry, what is PR industry doing from your vantage point to try to deal with that?
Well, I don't think it's just PR. I think this affects journalism too. What I just mentioned, Lee, is really a case around people taking fees to especially bloggers and influencers. So I think you're going to see a lot of litigation around that. I think the next big thing, and I wasn't here for this morning, but Cleveland.com is moving heavily into sponsored content. So I don't know many journalistic bodies that are going to be completely immune to getting into the sponsored content realm. And they see it as another business channel. Does it diminish journalistic integrity? I don't necessarily think so, as long as there's some sort of wall between those two things.
Yeah.
But journalistic entities have had to change their approach. They're obviously much slimmer. They're trying to find other ways to generate revenue. One way to do that is to try to start assigning people that are going to generate content for paid advertisers and people that use the service. So.
Yeah, I mean, that actually is well down the path. I mean, the New York Times native advertising revenue is one of the strongest growth revenue areas for them, and they have a whole studio devoted to creating it on behalf of their clients.
And my counsel would be that we have to be very transparent to the reader that is sponsored content.
Right.
That's being ethical. You have to be. Yeah. I mean, back in the day, trade magazines often, that model that you're recommending, I can remember them approaching us and saying that if you buy advertising, we'll run this story. Right. And we said, that's not earned media. We're not going to do that, So it's like, it's just a different version of it.
Oh, we have one more question in the back. Sorry, Damas.
Hi.
Okay.
Go ahead, Kayla.
Can you stand up?
Sure. Hi,
You're
my name's
way
Arkaela.
back there. Hi.
Yes, I'm a public relations student, and I have to say, after the conversation today, I'm a bit nervous about the distrust in my profession, and I wanted to ask you guys, how can I help combat the few bad seeds in our profession in order to make sure that journalists and the public trust us?
Excellent question.
Yeah,
I'm a
that's
professor,
good
but why
last
don't you, as a practicing professional?
Interesting to me that that would be your takeaway. You know, I feel like I asked, Mitch was here from the faculty earlier, and when I went through the J School here, there was not friction, but there was a little bit of a division between J School and PR. I don't know whether that still exists or not. You know, I'm in an industry where integrity, honesty, authenticity are absolutely the benchmark. And so the idea that there's distrust, there's probably plenty of people that practice public relations or some form of it in a way that's less than ethical. That's not exactly or ever what I've been a part of, and not something that I ever have any desire to be a part of. I think we have phenomenal relationships with journalists all over the world. Well, the reason for that is because of that transparency and authenticity, and also because we understand they have a job to do. We're not trying to get them to do something different. We're trying to help facilitate them doing a great job. So don't be too daunted by it, Arkaela. I think there's tremendous opportunities there.
And my advice to you and to other students is, and I've said this before, is that when you're interviewing for a job, we know you want to get a job, but be very careful. Interview that company too, and take a good look at who you're going to work for, what they stand for, what their ethical practices are. Because I always worked for a company where I could say, I don't advocate what this client's asking me to do, right, and we could walk away from it. And I think it's important that, as a young professional, that you be very careful about who you work for, particularly when you're still learning the business and developing your confidence, and that you have a good mentor to help you make those decisions. So you'll be fine.
Yeah, and I think just as a final thought on this, the same is true for journalists and PR professionals. We are both unlicensed professionals, yes, right? Nobody can tell you can't practice, right? You can't lose the way a doctor or a lawyer can lose her license. And so as a result, that means that there is a range of practitioners out there, some good, some bad. You always start out saying, well, I'm just going to associate myself with the good ones, and I'm going to have these boundaries, and I'm going to uphold them. And I know it's true for journalists that they often go into journalism that way and then find themselves in a situation where they're either being asked to do something or they're tempted to do something that would violate the standards that they set for themselves when they embarked on their career. And you have to be prepared for that moment and be prepared to do the right thing in that moment. And it often involves a risk on your part. You know, you may be risking your job, you may be risking your reputation with your boss, or your relationship with your boss, your relationship with a journalist or with somebody else, your relationship with a client. There's a fair amount of risk in that. And if you're risk averse, you will probably not choose the hard thing to do. But if you're prepared to take that risk, in order to do the right thing. In most cases, it will seem really, really awful and difficult in the moment, and you'll get an hour or a day or a week beyond that moment, and you'll be so relieved that you did the right thing. And so I think being prepared for that moment is the other thing that you can do. So, well, listen, this has been a fabulous conversation. Can we thank our panelists, Chaz and Michelle?